In the years prior to 1996's Scream, director Wes Craven had been experimenting with the horror genre, having become prevalent thanks to his early work on movies like 1972's The Last House on the Left, 1977's The Hills Have Eyes, and most famously, of course, 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street. Craven was known to be a director that focused on dark themes and often exploitative material. From The Last House on the Left's rape revenge plot to Elm Street's Freddy Krueger being a child murderer and presumably more, Wes Craven wasn't exactly one to hold back. But clearly he began to take a bit of a different direction come the early 90s, where he began to shine a light on horror in a bit of a different way. Now, rather than focusing solely on the bleakness of the horror genre, Craven decided that he wanted to get a bit more creative with it, to focus on the fun, essentially becoming a founding father of what we now know as the teen slasher genre, and leaning more and more into the horror comedy field. And Craven had his first go at poking fun at the metatextual context behind his films with the 1994's cult classic New Nightmare. New Nightmare acted as a rejuvenation of sorts for the Nightmare on Elm Street series, which had been considered basically dead for a few years after already having grown stale with several sequels throughout the 80s. Specifically, New Nightmare's predecessor, ironically named Freddy's Dead, having left a bad taste in audiences' mouths and essentially killing Elm Street's reputation once and for all. Or so it would seem, as hope returned to the franchise once more with New Nightmare, which represented a return for the director in a franchise that he'd created but had long ago left behind. Acting as a 10-year reunion for Craven and the series, and acting as kind of a saving grace for the entire franchise, New Nightmare was bringing everything back to its roots. With him, Wes Craven had brought a whole new envisioning of what a Freddy Krueger movie could be. With a plan to end the series here, New Nightmare was supposed to be a fan favourite and a fitting send-off to the beloved and horribly evil character in Freddy Krueger. But it flopped as well. Even worse. Making only just more than its budget of $8 million back, adjusting the total for advertising, the movie ended up making a total of $19.8 million, which yes, was a profit, but it didn't do nearly as well as one might have hoped and expected, and that definitely made this kind of a flop, and it made it the lowest grossing film in the Nightmare on Elm Street series to date, which was really not the way that Wes Craven wanted this film to go. It's a shame too, because New Nightmare is arguably the second best Elm Street film following only the original, and is a really fun and interesting film that explores the idea of a meta-narrative among characters and the creators as the film blurs the lines between what's real and isn't, even going as far to having deep cuts and inside jokes. But mainly the idea was to bring back Heather Langenkamp as herself, who in the universe of the film is also an actor who played Nancy in the original Nightmare on Elm Street film. And at the time new film, the actor portraying herself in Heather Langenkamp was also going to star in a new fictional Elm Street film, which would ironically bring Freddy Krueger's powers back through the fear of him and his newfound publicity through that fictional film within this real film in New Nightmare. You see where I'm going? All that dumb shit. It's kind of confusing, isn't it? And so throughout the film, the lines of reality blurs as she begins to get haunted by the real Freddy, and she begins to kind of become Nancy herself. Freddy's return is also kind of a gag within itself, as it's sort of a criticism of endless sequels and the monotony of Hollywood trends. Through this, New Nightmare both criticized the genre, all the while knowingly embodying it as well. The self-referential stuff works so well here because of this. What I think I love most about New Nightmare though is that it is still to the core a horror movie. It's not just a transformative comedy with a horror coat of paint on it. New Nightmare actually is first and foremost a Freddy Krueger Nightmare on Elm Street film, though it, leans more into the comedic side of it. And it does though intend to scare with a new look on the infamous villain and a big fun plot to wrap your head around. New Nightmare proves that you can be tongue-in-cheek and break the fourth wall, but yet still have that actual sense of fear too. And I love when movies get creative like this, so it really sucks that New Nightmare wasn't raved about from the audiences at the time. But to be fair, I just think that they didn't really get it yet. I think New Nightmare was a bit too ahead of its time in that way, and audiences weren't quite ready for the fresh take. But because it was ahead of its time, and because it was Wes Craven's little experimental film that could, Craven kept on with this idea. See, I think that if not for New Nightmare, we probably would have never gotten the classic teen slasher in 1996's Scream to begin with. At least not in the same way. Thanks to Craven's desire to get meta here, we got a whole new subgenre of satirical horror movies. And it wouldn't have happened at all if not for New Nightmare, which kind of feels like it played out as Craven's little practice run for what could later become Scream. I feel like New Nightmare was kind of the testing ground, the little practice run. I feel like New Nightmare walked and flopped and whatever so that Scream could run and try triumph. And I think that the Scream series here inherently portrays a side of Wes Craven, whether knowingly or not, that showed that he still had love for the horror genre, but it also showcases that he had issues with it too, and perhaps with his own contributions to it as well. With a fair mix of both pessimism and optimism, while he both literally vents frustration, while also making fun jabs at the Hollywood process as a whole. I think that Scream is really doing all sorts of things right, and New Nightmare was really the thing that started this kind of mentality. The difference between the two films in New Nightmare and the original Scream, though, was a subtle yet important distinction. So going along with the knowing of what worked and what didn't work with New Nightmare, 2 years later, Craven went on to work on directing Scream, an idea for a film that surprisingly he didn't originally come up with himself. I find this surprising when considering just how much the idea suited him, but the film was actually originally written by Kevin Williamson, a screenwriter who originally aimed to become an actor through the 90s. Failed on that front, but succeeded when he decided to study filmmaking. Scream then became his first script that actually got made into a movie. And a myriad of directors were considered to take the helm behind the film, including directors like Sam Raimi, who would have actually been pretty damn suitable and probably awesome as well. He probably would have been spectacular, if I'm being honest. Robert Rodriguez was also considered, and weirdly Danny Boyle, I don't know why. Of course though, Craven got the position in the end, apparently due to his stance on envisioning the film as a horror film first and foremost. You know, while the others were probably going to make it more zany and all that stuff, and as a comedy first, Craven wanted this to be a horror film, but that just had a bit more fun with the genre. So there was kind of this pairing between the two where they agreed on what Scream should be. So the two in Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson teamed up to make what would soon be considered a classic. Originally forerunning with the title of Scary Movie, a title in which would soon see the light of day in another film just a few short years later, the two collaborated to figure out what exactly would work and how far down the deep rabbit hole of meta material they could go and still have the film work for the mainstream. Here it is where Craven realized what may have gone wrong in his meta baby in New Nightmare. It was too Hollywood. New Nightmare was too referential and audiences weren't ready for that kind of thing. Without New Nightmare warming up audiences though, Scream might not have worked as well either. With what Craven learnt from New Nightmare, he probably wouldn't have applied this to the first Scream, and it probably wouldn't have worked so well. The film was full of experiments, Craven said about New Nightmare. Some of them worked and some of them didn't work so great. And so Craven learned this, and for Scream he went in a different direction. Instead of the old fogey filmmaker and producer and actress and all those guys being the people who were in the self-reflective story, Williamson made it the audience instead, and it just made a huge difference. Maybe there was too much narcissism or fascination with ourselves in New Nightmare, but that sort of flipping the flip in a way was a very smart thing to do. It removes the boundaries between viewer and film, and what could be scarier than breaking long established rules? And clearly he really did truly believe this, as we can see with the ongoings of the first Scream, in killing the most famous star in the film first, or second technically. Nobody expected Drew Barrymore to be killed during the first few minutes of the film at the time, or at all at the time. It set a precedent for the rest of the film though, now knowing that anybody could die, nobody was safe, because they could kill their biggest star just like that. There are no rules. Basically, Scream established itself as being this kind of twisting of pop culture and taking its shots at this formulaic filmmaking as much as it can. What you want to do is you want to put your audience off balance. You have to be aware of what audiences' expectations are, and then you have to pervert them, basically, and hit them upside the head from a direction they weren't looking. The Scream sequels ongoing after that then leaned more and more into this self-parodying idea with each entry to come. By the time we get to Scream 4, the film begins with an onslaught of subtext within subtext meta-narrative fun that plays out as kind of a montage of audience members killing and being killed as they watch the ongoings within the universe of the horror franchise of Stab. And it's still great. The Scream franchise is one of the few to actually be great throughout each and every entry. Some are clearly a little weaker than others. For the most part, I think that every Scream film is at least great to amazing. Much unlike what I imagine the fictional Stab movies are within the Scream films, which as we can kind of see throughout the little bits that we see in the Scream series, they kind of stepped up into being more and more silly and dumb and whatever. Scream, though, kind of stepped into this danger of becoming what it was criticizing through these Stab films, but it never did. It kind of rode that line and really stayed, you know, good. And as the Screams went on, so did too the stab movies within those films, which were Wes Craven's critique and perspective on what New Line eventually ended up doing to his own creation in the A Nightmare on Elm Street series. After letting go of the creative reins for that series, arguably or not, the creative quality diminished from sequel to sequel in that series. Personally, I argue that that's not exactly true because I do love them all. Sure, maybe the later sequels before New Nightmare kinda sucked, but they're still fun. But regardless, Craven viewed the series as having been killed based on his original idea of what the film was. And Stab is his commentary on this. Wes Craven: I think that the horror genre is very cyclical. There's usually a brilliant idea and then there's a series of sequels that get further and further from the originality of the first one. After everything though, I think that Scream kind of ended up killing the slasher genre, at least as we knew it at the time. Copycats tried to repeat the lightning in a bottle tone and aesthetic of Scream, but few really managed to succeed. In a way, Scream critiqued a genre that was really beginning to head on its way out, with New Nightmare being the last Elm Street film before its reboot in 2010, if we're excluding Freddy vs. Jason, and still nothing since again. And only a few Friday the 13th films after it, and then in 2009 there was the remake, and again, like Elm Street, nothing after it. Slashers were not at the height of popularity at the time, and so maybe that's why Scream was popular, because it ridiculed the genre that everybody was getting sick of. Though Scream revolutionized the idea of the genre for the time being, it did maybe act as the one final thing that the subgenre of slasher films probably didn't need at the time, and played as kind of the nail in the coffin for that subgenre. Because by pointing out all of the cliches that audiences were kind of getting sick of, they weren't now just going to go back to that very formulaic approach, and they weren't just going to go right back to the crap that Scream was criticizing. Regular old slashers just weren't going to cut it. And so the next era of the early 2000s horror genre had begun, and brought with it new trends in paranormal possession movies, as well as movies that upped the ante in terms of gritty realism and gore. Then that led into the 2010s with the elevated horror genre and that trend. And that's kind of where we still are. So yeah, I definitely think that Scream was impactful in good and bad ways, and I think that New Nightmare was really the reason that we got it. I absolutely love both films, and I find it interesting that they're linked in this particular way, because it was definitely this clear trajectory that Wes Craven was taking in going for this sillier approach and going for the meta approach and everything, and so there's kind of a lot that can be dissected with those. And so that's basically all that I have to say about New Nightmare and the first Scream at the moment, and I'm a head out now. Thanks for watching. Do all the things that the YouTubers say, please. Like and comment and share and subscribe, all that stuff, okay? I'm gonna go. Bye.